The ACT Party has again called for Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr to not be reappointed to his job next year. Well, I'm joined by NBR's political editor Brent Edwards. So, Brent, what's ACT's beef with Orr?
Well, I guess it's really asked what beef don't they have with Adrian Orr? I mean, largely it's based around the conduct of monetary policy and the fact that inflation is 7.3%, and so he gets a lot of the blame for having loosened monetary policy too much, too early, not responded quickly enough. Although ACT also clearly blames the government and Finance Minister Grant Robertson for having too loose a fiscal policy, but they also don't like the fact that Adrian Orr talks about Te Ao Māori approach, climate change, and inclusive economics, and they argue that's got nothing to do with what his core job is, which is simply to keep inflation between 1% to 3%.
What has the Reserve Bank done over the last 3 years or so that is different to other central banks around the world?
Well, it's nothing really. I mean, in terms of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, the bank pretty much followed much of what other central banks have done. Cut interest rates basically as low as it could, and then engaged in, I guess, what some people call unconventional monetary policy, quantitative easing, basically, the funding for lending program where it gave cheap money to the banks to lend out, those kinds of things, which most central banks around the world have done too. And across in Australia, for instance, the Reserve Bank of Australia and the governor there are facing sort of similar criticisms that, loose monetary policy has now come home to roost, and the reason that they've got high inflation and face the problems that they do is simply because the Reserve Bank loosened monetary policy far too much.
Well, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand here tightened its cycle quite early, last year.
Yeah, and that's a point that Adrian Orr's always made, that the Reserve Bank here was probably, I think, the first, or if not the first, sort of one of the first central banks to start tightening long before others did. But there's a lot of criticism still, and I think there's a broader criticism around the world that maybe central banks did get it wrong in the sense that they just loosened too much, and that in fact governments, in terms of using fiscal policy, should have taken more of the load in terms of dealing with the economic consequences of lockdowns and what have you that were put in place because of the pandemic.
Is this a case of political interference in the Reserve Bank's role?
Well, it's sort of interesting because it's always been this thing that, the Reserve Bank since 1990 has been independent, and it shouldn't be subjected, if you like, to political pressure. And that's the whole point, was that you'd have a Reserve Bank making decisions about interest rates free of all of the politics. But equally, actually, you think, certainly opposition politicians, have some right to comment around economic policy, and monetary policy is part of that, even if it's the reserve of the Reserve Bank. But I guess one of the interesting things has been, though, is how both the National Party and ACT have got quite personal. They are focusing on Adrian Orr. And I think one of the things that ignores is that it's not just Orr making these decisions. There is now a monetary policy committee. Adrian Orr is one member of that. And I'm sure he has a lot of influence, but he is only one member. He's not making decisions on his own.
Brent Edwards, thank you.